आने वाले कल की दस्तक हमें सुनाई देती है। नई मंजिल है जिस ओर हमें वो दिशा दिखाई देती है। नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए जोश से निकल पड़े हम, आने वाला कल होगा हमारा। नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
और नए इंडिया के सफर में टेक्नोलॉजी की शक्ति लेकर आपका भागीदार रहेगा रिलायंस। नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
नए जोश से निकल पड़े हम, आने वाला कल होगा हमारा। नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
और नए इंडिया के सफर में टेक्नोलॉजी की शक्ति लेकर आपका भागीदार रहेगा रिलायंस। नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
Hello.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi Ashish, how are you?
Yeah,
seeing
good
you.
afternoon. Same here.
Mr. Kishora, good seeing you.
Good afternoon.
I'm told there's
Good
going to be...
afternoon, Mr. Harish.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon. How are you? Mr. Uchida, Ms. Bangari.
Yeah, good afternoon.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Harishji.
Good afternoon. Being stylish is it? Friends, I've been told by CII that will be a delay of 5 minutes or so because they have a single YouTube broadcasting that they're doing. And while we can have a parallel session, their idea is also to let it go out on YouTube. So we'll have to wait until the previous session is extended beyond the timeline. So
for letting us know.
Welcome to the session, Mr. Nagarajan.
Thank you, Mr. Harish.
Good afternoon. My name is Danish Hashim. I am from CII. Since almost everyone is here, Chairman, Mr. P. Harish, would you like to start the session?
Yes, we were waiting for Shailesh. I just see that he has joined. I'm told that this session cannot be broadcast on YouTube until the other session has ended.
No, sir. There is no restriction on that front. Now we can start.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
At the outset, let me welcome all of you, my panelists who joined here. Mr. Uchida Makoto, the Managing Executive Officer, Head of Infrastructure and Environment Finance Group from the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. Anil Kishora, Vice President and Chief Risk Officer of the New Development Bank, who has had a long career in the Indian banking industry. Mr. Srini Nagarajan, the Managing Director and Head of Asia of the CDC Group of UK. Welcome to this session. My friend Ashish Kumar Chauhan, MD and CEO of the Bombay Stock Exchange. Ms. Harsha Bangari, Deputy Managing Director, Exim Bank of India. My friend and colleague in the bureaucracy formerly, Mr. Shailesh Pathak, Head Special Initiatives, Development Projects, LNG, IDPL India. Welcome to all of you. Before we start, I want to express my deep thanks to CII, who are our partners for this session today. This is the first Indo-Pacific Business Summit, and it is very appropriate that we are doing so. This has been a very good initiative and a precursor to many more such business summits in the future. We have just had 2 sessions in the forenoon session involving ambassadors of various countries who have brought forth their vision for business and economic engagement of countries in the Indo-Pacific. It has been a very fruitful engagement. This represents the 3rd session with a focus on the role of development finance institutions in the Indo-Pacific. Why is this important? We have seen that after over a year of the COVID pandemic and its huge negative impact on public health and on our economies in the Indo-Pacific countries, the need for a greater and active role of development finance institutions is being acutely felt. This is a decade of action for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We have the SDG 2030 gives us a blueprint for the post-COVID economic recovery that is both sustainable and inclusive. And for this, international cooperation and especially cooperation among countries in the Indo-Pacific is indispensable. Development financing has a very critical role because of the ongoing flux in the global economic scenario. It is becoming increasingly difficult for developing countries to access international capital and to use such international capital flows to fund investments that would help them achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by the year 2030, without risks of capital flow reversal, without debt crises or other forms of market instability. The Addis Ababa Action Agenda of 2015 spoke about moving from billions to trillions as far as development finance was concerned. In reality, in the year 2019, we see a very, very strange situation. For developing countries and emerging economies, the net capital inflows in 2019 were equal to the net capital outflows. Thus, the vision of the Addis Ababa Action Agenda has not been achieved because there has not been a net capital inflow into developing countries and emerging economies. In the Indo-Pacific region, most developing countries and the LDCs are running considerable current account deficits, and these are being matched by the domestic savings or by concessional funds. Most of the global capital in the pandemic era, we see, instead of moving to areas with deficient investment, is actually moving into areas with surplus investment, but with a more secure investment climate. Security of investment is taking precedence over the need for investment. So this pattern of investment is adding to inefficiency and enhancing the inequity that we see all around. In the pandemic period, there is also a global policy debate on development financing. This is happening in various fora, including the G20. And what we see is that the focus in these development fora has increasingly shifted to issues of green financing with an enhanced stress on climate change issues. Countries in the developing world which are already facing the impact of COVID and are in a very difficult economic situation are being asked to adhere to green recovery, and new conditionalities of green recovery are sought to be imposed. Green recovery conditionalities for countries that are really in a bad situation as far as COVID is concerned is a huge burden when they're already burdened by the economic impact of COVID. We continue to believe that while it may be preferable to have green recovery at all times, especially at a time like this when countries are really facing the negative economic impact of COVID, having additional green conditionalities would severely constrain and burden the recovery process for these countries. What we need is recovery, any kind of recovery rather than new conditionalities on green recovery. In low-income countries, we are again, blended finance and public-private partnership are vital. They are also likely to have rapid uptake. But risk mitigation is more complex. It requires greater project preparation time. So we need a complementary approach that has a judicious mix of innovative financing instruments, risk mitigation, risk sharing, mobilization of private finance, and strengthening cross-border capital flows towards sustainable development. We also hear in the policy debates that green financing must not lead to greenwashing, and sustainable financing instruments must not lead to SDG washing, as it is being said. And again, the burden is sought to be put on developing countries to prevent greenwashing and SDG washing. But what we see in reality is that raising of green capital and sustainable development capital, over 90% of it is happening in developed country capital markets. The overwhelming majority of green finance and sustainable development finance is being raised in developed country capital markets. And the onus of preventing SDG washing and greenwashing thus also falls on the regulators and the markets in the developed countries. We also have a compelling need for developed countries to extend a helping hand to LDCs in developing countries so that they are able to better access green finance and SDG finance from developed country capital markets. So we need a cooperative agenda. Yes, for the foreseeable future, climate change and sustainability are important issues. And having new instrumentalities for long-term funding, for closing the SDG financing gaps and mobilizing capital for sustainable development are very important. We would also require several thematic innovative financial instruments, sustainability-linked financial instruments, green, social, and sustainability bonds, for example, focused on financing directly projects contributing to achieving the SDGs. But again, the regulation of this and facilitating access to this, the greater share of the responsibility falls on developed countries rather than the developing countries, because that is where most of the finance is being raised. As we go through the development policy debates in the post-COVID period, we also have a heavy focus on green trade and sustainability trade, including talk of taxation on cross-border flow of goods and services, focused on carbon taxation. Again, this ignores the fundamental tenet of the UNFCCC framework, which is CBDRRC, where we take a clear view that there are differentiated responsibilities for developing countries, keeping in view the fact that they are involved in poverty alleviation efforts, they are at a different development trajectory, and would need more carbon space and more time for bringing their citizens out of poverty and being able to give them a reasonable living standard as compared to the developed countries. We also find that all these policy debates on development finance are happening when the commitments on climate finance and technology transfer made under the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement remain unfulfilled. The $100 billion per annum that was supposed to have been contributed by developed countries towards climate finance from the year 2010, almost having a backlog of $1 trillion, remains unfulfilled and unpaid. We see a similar situation on technology transfer to enable developing countries and LDCs to have affordable access to emerging green technologies, which can reduce the carbon footprint of their development process. None of these have materialized, yet there is focus and pressure that they should resort to giving a cutoff date, for example, on net zero commitment of this kind, which would be unrealistic, keeping in view that there are differentiated responsibilities between developed and developing countries. I would also like to say that the policy debate on development finance is increasingly also leading to reducing the salience of official development assistance and concessional finance and assistance being made available through multilateral development banks to enhancing at a proportional rate the salience of private sector and blended finance. There is no doubt that private sector finance and blended finance is vital for developing countries to have access to development financing options. At the same time, that should not lead to soft pedaling the commitments made by developed countries to provide ODA assistance to developing countries and the LDCs. That constitutes a very vital source of development finance. Likewise, concessional finance that the multilateral development banks provide, they are vital too. So while we should focus on private finance, blended finance, and other PPP structures, we should not downplay the salience of ODA, concessional finance, not only from national governments to developing countries, but also from the MDBs to developing countries so that they have access to these funds to facilitate. We have also seen a focus on looking at remittances as a source of development finance. I think we should also disabuse ourselves that remittances sent by people working and sending back monies to their households for maintenance is somehow a form of development finance. Far from it. These remittances are vital household living expenses where people go and they live and work in hardship and are able to save money and send it back to their homes for vital household living expenses. They do not constitute a form of development finance. So while we should diversify the array of development financing options that we have, we should not cast things like household remittances or downplay or soft pedal the importance of ODA and concessional finance from developed country national governments and from multilateral development banks to LDCs and to developing countries. With these broad remarks on the emerging debates on development finance, I think we are well set to proceed to our next speaker, Mr. Uchida Makoto, the Managing Executive Director and Global Head of Infrastructure at JBIC. May I invite you, sir? You have 10 minutes and I look forward, and we all look forward to hearing you.
Thank you for introducing me. I would like to thank you for inviting us to the Indo-Pacific Business Summit. JBIC is a policy-based financial institution, and our mission is to maintain and improve the international competitiveness of Japanese industry. So it's because of we are the policy-based financial institution in Japan, and Mr. Hash addressed the climate change. Our mission is also including the to maintain and improve to protect the global environment, including the prevention of global warming In June 2021, last month, JBIC announced its fourth medium-term management plan. We update this management plan every 3 years. Brand new management plan show us focus on the following priority issues. Number one is addressing energy transformation toward a decarbonized society. And number two is strengthening and rebuilding international supply chain. In order to achieve these priorities, JBIC has established the post-corona global growth facility. It's a special facility as a special menu to strengthen its support for such policy critical projects. Decarbonization and supply chain resilience were the main topics of the discussion in the meeting between Prime Minister Modi from India and our governor, Mr. Maeda, in November last year. And also between Jaishankar, Minister of for External Affairs from India, and Mr. Maeda, our governor, in April this year. These agenda now JBIC is working on also in line with the policy direction of the Indian government. This year, the last March this year, the Quad Summit, as you know, was held in the United States. At this meeting, it was agreed to set up the several working groups, including increasing the vaccine production in India and addressing the climate change, and finally the supply chain for critical technology. JBIC is a member of the vaccine working group. We believe that it will be increasingly important for the India and Japan to work together to resolve the issue in Indo-Pacific region, making use of such material frameworks. Then I would like to highlight some of the notable achievements of JBIC in the Pacific region. I believe that these notable achievements show us to how we can address to invite money flow from developed country to a developing country. In October last year, JBIC signed a 500 million loan agreement with NTPC, India's state-owned power utilities, for projects such as the solar power generation and the installation of the desalinization equipment in existing thermal power plant. The loan, which covered 21 projects in 13 states, is aimed at promoting the renewable energy and the reduction of air pollution in India through these projects. Next one is in March this year, JBIC also provided the project finance for the construction and the operation of a waste management and power generation project in Dubai. The project is one of the largest waste treatment and power generation plant in the world, and aim to expand clean energy in the UAE by using the Hitachi Zosen, which is a Japanese companies, which has a large share of the global market on the waste treatment. This project is, utilize PPP structure. Japanese company is participating as sponsors. JBIC has also provided assistance to small, medium enterprise in India affected by COVID-19, and signed a loan agreement with the State Bank of India to support the supply chain of the Japanese automobile manufacturers in India. JBIC believes that this is in line with the Modi government's resilient in their policy. My understanding is that Japan has advocated the concept of free open Indo-Pacific, and JBIC has been strengthening its tie with USDFC and DFAT and Export Financial Agency from Australia by concluding the minutes of the understanding in order to play a leading role in this direction. In January this year, JBIC provided a loan to the National Submarine Cable Corporation of the Republic of Palau. This is the first project to be undertaken under the framework of the Japan, US, Australia trilateral cooperation. JBIC is also the founding member of the Asian Export-Import Bank of Association, which was established in 1996. It's promoting the cooperation with institutions in the Pacific region through this association. Actually, so that together with India Exim Bank. India Exim Bank also have participated since 1996 from beginning. The number of the institutions included JBIC with a function not only of the export bank, but also of a development finance institution is increasing. And we believe that there will be more opportunities in the future to support the infrastructure under the cooperation or the collaboration of the other export banks. In line with the vision of the free and open Indo-Pacific, JBIC has been working to expand infrastructure and strengthen the industry in the region. JBIC will continue to strengthen its support for the clean energy, such as the wind and the waste power, and its efforts to address COVID-19. We will continue to work in partnership with the relevant Indian institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Uchida, for those remarks. Yes, important partner for vaccine production in India. Supply chain resilience is a very important aspect, and we'll continue to work closely with JBIC on clean energy, including solar and waste treatment and SMEs. Thank you very much for your remarks. May I now request Mr. Anil Kishora, Vice President and Chief Risk Officer of New Development Bank, to give an MDB perspective to the discussion on development finance, especially the role in the Indo-Pacific region. Mr. Kishora.
Thank you, Mr. Harish. Good afternoon, esteemed panelists and guests. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to join the discussion today on the role of DFIs in the Indo-Pacific region. Let me first of all thank the CII for the invite. As I joined the conversation today, I realized that the idea of the Indo-Pacific has always been much broader than geographical boundaries outlined by the two oceans, the Indian and the Pacific. Over the last millennium, this region has established many important maritime routes and served as an epicenter for economic, cultural, religious, and trade interconnectedness among countries. The Indo-Pacific region, as we know, now accounts for 62% of global GDP and 46% of the world's merchandise trade. Broadly, many nations in the region rely on trade-oriented growth with an outward-looking strategy. Thus, connectivity enabling infrastructure such as roads, ports, airports play a crucial role in driving sustained growth. We all know that the ground situation requires us to invest much more in the region's infrastructure. According to the GI Hub, infrastructure investment needs in Asia are estimated at around USD 50 trillion between 2016 and 2040. Funding such large infrastructure gaps is beyond the remit of any single set or group of institutions. Nor government funding alone can suffice. The need of the hour is for partnerships at a scale, partnerships between the public and private markets. It is a fact that nearly $20 trillion were globally invested in debts yielding negative or near negative returns as of end 2020. How do we nudge these resources into funding infrastructure? One of the main levers could be to de-risk infrastructure projects for private capital to flow in. The private sector will more likely invest in long-term infrastructure if political and other risks are well mitigated. For instance, projects need to be structured to offer clearly defined exits for private investors. Galvanizing private sector capital requires earlier stage public investment with perhaps policy support. DFIs are well positioned to support such initiatives, creating a vibrant crowding in effect at the end. I believe the multilateral development banks, including the new development bank that I represent today, can play a strong role. MDBs can contribute along 4 dimensions: finance, ESG, project design, and synergy building. First of all, MDBs can finance viable infrastructure projects that help countries realize their development ambitions, including the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. MDBs and national DFIs can join hands to expand the pool of investable resources. NDB, for instance, has been working closely with some of the DFIs in a few of our member countries. Secondly, MDs bring in credible ESG standards and political de-risking. This expands their scope for mobilizing resources from the private sector. Investors looking for sustainable development or ESG benefits are incentivized to contribute. Thirdly, MDBs are well positioned to provide technical assistance for preparing and implementing projects that better deliver sustainable development and promote inclusive, resilient infrastructure development. And finally, leverage MDB's enormous convening power to bring multiple stakeholders together to facilitate exchange of ideas, best development practices, knowledge, and data across counterparts and countries, building and enhancing the capacity of key players who outline and manage infrastructure projects. Ladies and gentlemen, before I end, a few words about the new development bank. NDB was established by BRICS countries in 2015. It is headquartered in Shanghai. The bank has gained momentum in development with $50 billion in subscribed capital, robust credit ratings, and 79 projects totaling about $30 billion in approvals. Transport infrastructure, which supports the construction and rehabilitation of ports, roads, airports, etc., has historically constituted one of NDB's major strategic operational areas. It accounted for 23% of cumulative approvals by the end of 2020, which is almost 1/4 of our entire portfolio. In a short period of its existence, NDB has established itself as a premier development institution and a trusted partner for our borrowers. We have established a progressive framework to do things at a speed with due regard to quality and globally accepted standards. We plan to strive to maximize developmental impact in our areas of operations and be a major player in the global financial community. I believe in this quote from Mahatma Gandhi, "The future depends on what we do in the present," and I think what DFIs can do now is to envision a collaborative approach to supporting infrastructure development in this important region. DFIs, MDBs included, can join hands to support this region that contributes to almost 2/3 of global GDP and nearly half the global trade. Let me stop here and once again thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kishore. I think de-risking infra projects is very important, especially for private sector capital to flow in. And you did outline the 4 ways in which the New Development Bank and other MDBs can assist. On the ESG, it's a very important aspect. What role can the MDBs play? And standards and political de-risking is important, but the standards must stick to the overall mandate of the UNFCCC and must take into account the differentiated responsibilities of the developed and the developing countries. That is the hope of all the developing countries and the LDCs, that MDBs have a very important role to play in standard setting on development finance provision, and adhering to differentiated responsibility lies at the heart of it. May I now invite Mr. Srini Nagarajan, Managing Director, Head of Asia of CDC Group. We look forward to hearing about your experiences in the region, in Africa, where you were earlier, and to understand better your perspective on the role of DFIs in the Indo-Pacific region. Mr. Srini.
Thank you, Mr. Harish, and you kind of enumerated all the points extremely well. Thank you for that, and a pleasure to be a part of this forum, and thanks CII for it. Just as a background, CDC is a UK government-owned development financial institution and the world's oldest DFI, formed 70 years back. We invest in South Asia and Africa. South Asia for us is all the SAARC countries and Myanmar, where more than 1/3 of the world's poor people live. And over a period of time, we'll be investing in other parts of Asia too, predominantly Southeast Asia. Our capital is generally additive in these markets. We make sure that we don't crowd out private capital. That's an important part of what we do. Our capital is much more distinguished to attract more private capital into this. So mobilization for CDC is a very important thing, really. CDC invests across the capital structures. We invest in equity, long-term debt in project finance, and as long as the money is used for creating new assets, and mezzanine structures as well, really. Climate change is a very important topic for us. And as we have signed up to the Paris Accord, our goals are aligned to 3 things: net zero by 2050, just transition, that is supporting a net zero economy by keeping the creation of decent jobs and skill development at the forefront of the change, adaptation and resilience, that is strengthening adaptation and resilience of sectors, community, businesses, and people who are affected because of the climate change, really. We are also a very unique DFI that we have created subsidiaries and continue to create, which not many DFIs do in this world. We created a subsidiary in India called IANA, which is now a joint venture with the government of India and has 1.7 gigawatt now and going up to 10 gigawatt, along with the government of India's NIIF, really. We have a subsidiary in Africa called Globalec with Norfund, which is the independent largest IPP in Africa, with around 1.4 gigawatt and 2 gigawatt in pipeline. And we also have a subsidiary called GridWorks, specifically to build T&D in Africa. And our mission from 2021 is to invest 30% of new investments in clean energy assets. So that's our commitment to climate change. Climate change for us does not stop with just renewable energy power. It goes across the spectrum, across sectors. And we focus on CNI, we focus every sector we invest in, that is food and agriculture, healthcare, education, financial services. We use climate change as a very important parameter, really. And we work with a number of bodies within the countries where we invest in. So typically, I think private project finance are funded by equity to the extent of 20-30%. So critical aspect for every country is to focus on widening the lender base and addressing the structural requirements to make sure that you're able to that these lenders are able to expand the capacities. If the lender interest is there, the sponsors will follow, really. Typically, that's how these countries will work. I'll put the lenders into 3-4 buckets. Of course, one is the development financial institutions, the guarantors like MEGA, export credit agencies like ECA, international commercial banks, local banks. What's important, of course, in these for investment grade countries, sovereign rating, the prioritization will be much higher. For non-investment grades, it will be challenging to attract international commercial banks unless there is an IFA or an ECA guarantee is available. Really, that's something to be borne in mind. If you look at the ASEAN countries today, I think they have a lot of aspiration. They're growing in population. The current energy mix, they all know it's indigenous, is not sustainable as indigenous sources are depleting. And definitely there is a drift towards making sure that 25 to 35% of the total primary capacity is led by renewable energy sources, really. And there is a concerted effort which is being set up to target energy, develop the policy framework, and establish a robust institution as a result of this. What we need to bear in mind is three things. Number one, the concept of just transition is a very important one. If you look at Malaysia, Petronas accounts for 1/3 of the revenue. And if you look at, and a similar dynamic exists in Indonesia as well, for example, in terms of its large reserves of coal, etc. If these countries will want to be reassured that whatever comes next will replace the job revenues and exports that will be lost as a result in a clean energy transition, it's a very important, so the just transition agenda is a very important component of this. India, for example, today is at around 95 gigawatt with an aspiration to go up to 175 gigawatt by 2025. And similarly, Pakistan and Bangladesh also have large aspirations within our own geographies. If you look at the G7 communique recently, coal power generation is still the biggest cause for greenhouse gas emission. Coal still represents 81% of the world's energy produced. The target is to decline by 80% in 2020 levels by 2030, really. So globally, 39% of the coal plants are uncompetitive, and the target is to reduce it to 73% by 2025. However, in developing countries, like Mr. Harish said, India's 83% of coal power is still competitive, and moving away from coal will have an annual cost of around $21 billion. So the just transition part of the agenda is a very important component, as much as creating new capacities for renewable. And there are three main things as far as this transition is concerned. Governance, because the countries and the regulatory reforms for roadmap for this. People and communities need to look at the livelihood of communities in coal and other sectors dependent on coal sector. For example, railways in India. And third one is infrastructure, plant decommissioning, repurposing of these coal plants, and reclamation of coal mines, etc. CDC and its accomplished climate team are continuing to play a pivotal role in this journey across various countries, particularly the emerging markets. I think the most enticing thing today is that on ESG per se, regulators, shareholders are beginning to recognize the business and the financial impact of ESG risks. ESG can no longer be treated as a mere compliance issue or cost of doing business. Corporations are now aiming to embed ESG principles as a part of the core strategy, but this is a journey. We still have some way to go here, really. So there are common ways of just transition, which we are trying to tackle in some of the major countries like India, which can be shared across these countries. That's a very big part of the journey, as much as new capacity creation, as I said earlier. Renewable energy also requires energy integration and grid connectivity and the ability of the power system to take the load. This is an important learning between the countries which should share. Of course, the third one is the storage and the real-time grid management and grid interconnection is also a very important component of this. India, for example, has successfully implemented the reverse auction process, which is working extremely well. And these are learnings from countries like India, which can then be transported to the other countries. Mr. Harish talked about the concept of blended finance. I quite agree with him that a key area through which different sources of funding which help unlock private capital into our markets is having the right structures that take risk, really. For example, the hybrid and the storage technologies are very expensive at the moment. Specifically on these new areas of climate finance, which has got a limited track record and where the cost is high, for example, batteries, options such as blended finance, viability gap funding instruments, or technical assistance facilities can help unlock institutional capital into this space. That's a very important component of this. The last thought I want to leave on the table is about COP26. One area that European Development Financial Institutions, CDC, and also COP26 team have been helping shape is the concept of country platforms for scaling investments in countries by providing a platform for engaging policymakers and investors on the policy and the regulatory change needed and the resources to support those. B, resources to develop the pipeline of investable opportunities, and C, raise viability and build co-investment strategies between DFIs and investors. UK, being the most important financial center, is taking a lead to help other countries in creating the enabling environment for raising international capital. These are my early thoughts, Mr. Harish, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Srini, for your remarks. I think just transition is important, and you have rightly focused on just transition. While we look at the need to move and reduce the carbon footprint, increasingly we have forgotten the most important SDG, the SDG that calls for responsible and sustainable consumption. What we witness now around the world is, as we face the challenge of climate change, the developed countries are not reducing consumption, but shifting energy consumption from non-renewable sources of energy to renewable sources of energy. This does not change the material footprint, though it may reduce the carbon footprint. And the consequences of accumulation of the material footprint of renewable sources of energy will certainly be felt in the next couple of decades. So we have a strange situation when enormous amounts of energy are being poured into converting non-renewable energy sources to renewable energy sources, and the vital development priorities of the developing and the LDCs are getting lost in this. So this is an issue. And this is where development financial institutions and the MDBs must not only ask for reducing the carbon footprint, but must ask for having responsible consumption as a main goal for the developed countries. As the Prime Minister said, our per capita footprint, carbon footprint, is 60% lower than global average. Our energy consumption is a pittance as compared to the global average, and India's per capita income is a very, very small fraction of either the G7 or the G20 average. So increasingly, a just transition equates to responsible and sustainable consumption. And I believe the development financial institutions and the MDBs have a vital role, not just to convert non-renewable sources of energy to renewable sources at a huge cost and impose this model on the developing countries and the LDCs, but to curtail the consumption and insist on responsible consumption and sustainable consumption, which lies at the root of the current model of industrialization. I now give the floor to Ashish Kumar Chauhan. My friend Ashish Bhai, you have the floor. We look forward to hearing you. Ashish, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Mr. Harish. It's a pleasure and honor to be speaking at this event. I would like to also thank CII for this opportunity. In a way, I represent private sector and sort of a private sector as a collective. Somewhere on the line, if you look back over last 50, 60 years of the development financial institutions, they've slowly become less important in the world vis-a-vis what they were, say, 30 years back or 50 years back. The money at their disposal was several times much higher compared to the GDPs of the country or countries they were trying to help. Today, if you look at the numbers, including the newer multilateral banks being set up, overall the world GDP has gone up, and the kitty which is available to the development financial institutions, all put together, has actually reduced as a percentage. And for me, that is a cause of worry, because as I think rightly Mr. Harish pointed out, that overall there is a balance of capital movement between LDCs and the developed countries. And somewhere on the line, we need to have capital move and get invested into the LDCs to raise the livelihood and create infrastructure for the LDCs. And that's where I think India's example is very, very interesting, that over last 30 years, we've had, or rather last 50 years, we have had several financial institutions. And one of the constraints they faced was to continue to search for funds. In some ways, that has been resolved by making them into commercial banks or universal banks, instead of being only the development financial institutions. Of course, to promote the development even further, including the SDG and green activities. The government of India has announced setting up of a new development financial institutions in the budget for the year 2021-22. So I think it's coming back into vogue, but it will require a little bit of thinking about how to create continual funds for those institutions. And that's where I think overall the public markets can play a great role in raising funds for this kind of institutions. BSE last year alone, in year 2020-21, primary raised $253 billion of funds, out of which almost 60%, $150 billion were for the short-term papers, and around $80 billion was long-term debt. The rest was equities. But effectively, the Indian markets are now able to raise funds for Indian businesses and Indian governments, including municipal corporations, including state governments, as well as central government. And the new instruments that are required also, I think RBI has come out with the sovereign gold bonds, which are very, very interesting instruments covering the gold risk, but effectively using that money for other purposes. Similarly, India has also set up a new IFSC, International Financial Services Center, which started functioning in 2017. So it's a 4-year-old IFSC where the India International Exchange, which was set up by BSE, has now helped raise $50 billion of funds for Indian corporates. But the same infrastructure can be also used to raise funds from multilateral agencies as well as private sector initiatives to raise funds for the countries in the Indo-Pacific region as the where all the financiers, including private equity, venture capital, insurance companies, and everyone else is now coming into the gift city. So for me, we are becoming a very important source of learning and acting as catalyst. The last point I would like to make that somewhere on the line, I take infrastructure now in the modern sense in two parts. One is what I call hard infrastructure, which is basically the ports, the airports, roads, electricity generation, and so on and so forth. And the second part is what I call soft infrastructure. That is the part where basically the software or the new technologies help you create great amount of wealth, but great amount of happiness also per capita. And that's where I think somewhere on the line, India has also created situations or frameworks which can actually be replicated. Yesterday, Honorable Prime Minister of India, Sri Narendra Modi ji, had a conference on CoWIN, which is an e-governance platform, which is now being made open source for the entire world to use as and when they feel like. And similarly, the Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile Treaty, which can actually create a fintech paradigm in the entire Indo-Pacific region, especially LDCs in the Indo-Pacific region, where now India is doing 3 billion transactions per month. That can also be considered as an infrastructure. Sometimes whenever we talk, because we are all talking only finance and large finance or big finance, we worry about only the large infrastructure projects which require a lot of risk and a lot of money. Whereas this small little bit of infrastructure sort of catalyzing in soft infrastructure can go a long way in creating a good, happy society for every LDC. And I would say that India, in some ways, is leading in direct benefit transfers of subsidies to farmers, subsidies to widows, subsidies to every poor person using technology. And those kind of things also should be considered as a part of this infrastructure framework. And they don't require that much money, but the impact that they can create, even including in projects. For example, last week, Honorable Prime Minister actually in India reviewed the projects of low income housing construction, and he used drones to see on live basis what is happening on those projects. Those are the kind of things, even for the higher cost activities or higher risk activities, you can use the newer technologies which India is using to reduce the risk and make what I call just transition or just sort of society in a better way. So for me, in some ways, I have been a development uh, uh, sort of person when I started my career as a development banker. And so this is very close to my heart. But somewhere in the line, the life is also changing very rapidly. And the newer technologies, newer ways of doing things also should be part of our agenda in getting more bang for our buck going forward. And of course, reducing the risk on the financials. BSE also does provide the green bond listing. We also have Carbonex, which measures the carbon emissions of the companies and adjust their weight onto the index. Similarly, we have GreenX, which measures even on a larger perspective and changes the weightage in the index. And basically, India is at the forefront even on thinking on the corporate governance for the SDG purposes. Most of our regulations slowly become part of the rest of the world. And that's where BSE as a flag bearer, I would say, has done a yeoman's job. And we have been working with most institutions across Indo-Pacific region, but we would also continue to provide the expertise and also training at BSE and other institutions of financial markets to ensure that the private sector and public sector both together and multilateral development banks put together are able to fund the necessary funding that is required by LDCs going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish Bhai, for those remarks. I think the innovation through which municipalities and state governments can raise bonds, raise funds, the RBI sovereign gold bonds have really changed the scenario. You did raise the issue of IFSC and Gift City, very important institutions. I think that has really emerged as a game changer in attracting a number of financial institutions from around the world to establish base in India. We look forward to that strengthening. They are having tie-ups with other regulators, with other structures. And the fact that multiple regulators are rolled into one there and it's a single window process really makes it that much easier for people to locate there. Your point on hard and soft infrastructure is well taken, as also the excellent role played by the Bombay Stock Exchange in helping entrepreneurs raise capital and in also bringing about innovations like the Carbonex or the GreenX in giving an index for the ESG funds so that investors could invest appropriately in these instruments. May I now invite Ms. Harsha Bangari, Deputy Managing Director, Exim Bank of India, to give her remarks.
Thank you, Mr. P. Harish. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody, my distinguished fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. It's our pleasure to be associated with this very important event, which is being co-hosted by the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, and CII. As we were discussing earlier, the Indo-Pacific region continues and will always continue to be of strategic importance by sheer size, in terms of everything, in terms of global population, roughly 64%, in terms of even the contribution to global GDP, again, over 60%, and given that 50% of the global trade traverses through its waters. At India, we have been fostering greater integration with the Indo-Pacific region through our initiatives like the Security and Growth for All in the region and Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative. This highlights the country's vision for the region, with ASEAN remaining the central focus for all these initiatives. In addition, over the years, we've also increased our collaboration with the key partners like Australia, Japan, and United States in the Indo-Pacific, known as Quad. Coming to infrastructure and quality infrastructure, which everybody agrees is a prerequisite for developing countries to achieve their sustainable development goals. And many countries in this region are plagued by a range of infrastructure gap. In fact, we have estimates from ADB, which talks about a huge investment requirement of over USD $1.7 trillion annually in various sectors, including power, transport, communications, and water and sanitization. There are lots of challenges regarding infrastructure development, and the green and the climate change mitigation, of course, plays a very, very important role in all these concerns. Again, infrastructure development does not make itself amenable to traditional financing sources, given that any particular infrastructure project would require huge financing. And again, the financing would be required for very, very long tenors. And then it becomes a state subject. That's where, we keep talking about the need for a private sector to step in, because the risks which get attached to these type of financing typically are not really very, very credit desirable. In the current pandemic, this has become more highlighted, given that the national budgets of most of these countries have moved, from developmental activities to pandemic mitigation efforts. And anyways, we all have to be very mindful of our fiscal deficits in the whole operating environment. Here, I would say the role of the export credit agencies and development finance institutions together and jointly become very critical. Historically, the development financial institutions were created by the governments of the countries around the world to promote economic growth and social support and support social development. Again, the need was that the financing long-term risky projects of strategic importance typically would not be done by the commercial banking or lending setup in the world. As such, the DFIs, or what we call as development financial institutions, could play a crucial role as countries work to stem the unprecedented challenges of the pandemic. There should be effort for supporting and preparing economies in the Indo-Pacific to become more significant players in the global supply chains. So, for example, as India, we are actually seeking avenues where we could become, or we could contribute to becoming, an important player in the global supply chains. And this could only be achieved through infrastructure development in the region. It would also be useful for DFIs to collaborate with international banks and ECAs, DFIs in other regions to explore feasibility of co-financing. Again, given the size and nature, co-financing always gives that much more comfort and support to the financing agencies, especially given that these are cross-border transactions and projects of common interest. So we could use a PPP-led model of project finance in their respective regions. Greater support, of course, in the current environment would also be required for investment in the healthcare sector, and countries are scrambling actually to ramp up their infrastructure projects. So this is becoming more highlighted in the current environment. I would say collaboration becomes very important criteria, which we need to add to the DFI setup, because again, the experiences of DFIs, which they have gained over a period of years in cross-border financing, including financing to sovereigns, could be fully leveraged. Ichida-san from JEBIC, of course, mentioned the AEBF setup, that is Asian Exim Banks Forum setup. And I would say that this forum has actually given a lot of comfort and cooperation for mutual benefit, because we have shared experiences, and we hope to continue and leverage, and accordingly the members could sort of benefit from this relationship. We need to extend technical assistance by sharing our expertise and experiences among our own economies, and more importantly with other partner developing countries, again in the various areas of agriculture, education, health, governance, and institutional capacity development. Coming to India Exim Bank, we have been supporting Indian companies to execute projects overseas, which do not only help partner countries in meeting their development objectives, but also results in promotion of exports and creation of jobs in India. At Exim India, we have Government of India supported lines of credit and buyer's credit under National Export Insurance Account, which remains a proactive mechanisms to help beneficiary countries in achieving their developmental goals. In terms of sheer numbers, we have today more than 300 Government of India supported lines of credit, which we through which we cover around 65 countries, and we have commitments in aggregate of over $30 billion, of which I would mention that 2/3 of these commitments actually are to the countries in the Indo-Pacific region. On the ESG and socially responsible investment, this is a continuing dialogue we as Exim Bank have with our investors. We have been issuing green bonds. We have issued green bonds in the past. We have also issued socially responsible investment bonds. This is, but at the same time, given the the developmental role which we play, where we provide infrastructure financing to developing countries, I would dare say that we don't really check all the boxes which are required for a ESG framework. As Mr. Harish very rightly mentioned, that most of the beneficiary countries are at different developmental trajectory. And just to give an illustration, a thermal power project, although not liked by any of our investors, would become a transition to green recovery for a particular country, given that currently that country depends only on diesel generator sets, which is much more polluting. So I would submit that this is more relative. And of course, at Exim Bank, we walk a very tight rope. Again, given that we need to be very, very mindful, and we believe in ESG, climate change mitigation, but at the same time, given that the role of the institution would be development, and again in the infrastructure and social sector, uh, I would say it's a green, very, very tightrope walking, and that's something which we continue as a dialogue with the investors. And just to conclude, what could really help is building of mutually beneficial partnerships with multilateral development banks and other institutions. And that is something which we look forward to. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Harsha Bangari, on this. I think, yes, you're right. We need to keep in mind, even as we evaluate projects from the ESG perspective, the importance of CBDRRC, the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. That is a cardinal principle of the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement frameworks. I have now the pleasure of inviting my dear friend Shailesh Pathak, Head Special Initiatives at L&T, IDPL India. Shailesh, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Harish. As Harish Bhai said, we have known each other for long enough for me to call him a good friend. So thank you very much, Ministry of External Affairs, the Economic Diplomacy Division, for organizing this. And I speak as a pure private sector person. So the Economic Diplomacy Initiative will actually bring us more business. And ultimately, all of us in business are looking at cash flow. So if we can expand that cash flow with the active help of development finance institutions and MEA, God bless. Thank you, CII, for co-hosting this. A little word about Larsen & Toubro. For those who don't know about L&T, if you have flown into India, there is a 100% probability that you have landed in an airport that was built by L&T. So we are large in the infrastructure sector. We are also large in the high technology and services, IT services space. And of course, other projects, including developmental projects, which we define as our investments, unlike a pure contractor play. Coming to the Indo-Pacific part and the role that development finance institutions can play in the Indo-Pacific, I would say that, it's time that India rose to the opportunity offered by the Indo-Pacific. I remember as a speaker in Jakarta in the Indian Ocean Rim Association meeting, I realized that the Indonesian name for the Indian Ocean in the map that Indonesia has is Samudra Hindia. Samudra Hindia. So, I mean, our roots and our ties go back such a long time. It's time we convert that into business. And I think ASEAN is a great business enabler for the group of nations there. How can we synergize into that? L&T works across the region in 30 countries. Many of them are in the Indo-Pacific. And on a personal note, I have been in the BRICS Business Council for a fairly long time, as also in the B20. And I can see that how some countries in the Indo-Pacific have done so well using targeted development finance. And these development finance institutions could be bilateral, like JBIC or Korea Development Bank, or they could be multilateral, Asian Development Bank, World Bank, or now the AIIB and the New Development Bank that Mr. Kishora is representing. Now, as a private business representative, my suggestion would be that the private sector will not really come to the development finance institutions. And the only reason is time. And there's a specific example I wanted to share with this very esteemed group. You know, L&T conceptualized, financed using loans with State Bank of India as lead, the largest ever PPP project in India, which is called the Hyderabad Metro. Now, Hyderabad Metro today is fully operational. It's got 69 kilometers. It's the second largest network of metro after Delhi. And we've got a 12,000 crore loan number. And we want to issue bonds because it's a fully operational network. You can see the cash flows. So we want to replace the bank loan with bonds. And when we tried exploring the option of raising money in terms of green bonds from development finance institutions, we realized that it would take us 6 to 9 months. Whereas being a AAA company, we can just go to the market and raise it in the next 2 months. The entire tranche of bonds with whatever 3 to 5 year maturities, we can easily do in 3 months. So a company like ours would find it difficult to go to development finance institutions, not because of the coupon rate, not because of the number of, but because of the diligence involved. One of the questions that we got in our Hyderabad Metro dialogue was, we know that the Hyderabad Metro is fully operational, but the land that was acquired for it, we want to do diligence on whether the land acquisition was fairly done or not. I mean, this is just bureaucratic approaches to financing, and I hope new generation, more nimble development finance institutions will get over all this. There is a limit to how much ESG you can talk about. There is also something called analysis paralysis, and I'm happy that I'm following Harsha ji, because Exim Bank is our external development bank, and we hope that the internal development bank, which is the NABFID, the development finance institution announced by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman ji, comes into effect as soon as possible and learns all the right lessons from successful startup DFIs like AIIB and NDB. So that's on the private sector experience. Now, I started my career in a development finance institution, as it then was. And we could raise money easily because our bonds were eligible for statutory liquidity ratio coverage. Now, I was looking at the NABFID section 17 and the kind of activities that our new development finance institution is supposed to undertake. And if implemented well, I think it'll be a real shot in the arm for the Indian ecosystem. Of course, I was in a group call with L&T and Exim, where we can see how much Exim can support us going into external markets. But broadly, what is the role of development finance institutions? It is largely where the ERR is greater than the IRR, where the economic rate of return is greater than the internal rate of return, right? So something like a water supply system, can I get an internal rate of return of more than 18% on a water supply system? Probably not. But is the economic rate of return of that water supply system far in excess of the financial returns? Of course. So if there's a highly profitable project, then there is no need for development finance institutions. It is only where the economic rate of return is higher that DFIs come in. And I'll give you a small example. I think one of the most outstanding projects being undertaken in India right now is something called the Jal Jeevan Mission. And this is to ensure that there is piped water connection to every single household in the country. Now there are, I follow that Jal Jeevan dashboard. I would strongly recommend that. I think Prime Minister Modi's single biggest achievement for the poor in the next 3 years will be that there are 190 million households in India. Out of 190 million, only 17% had piped water connectivity in their homes. 17%. This was in August 2019. And he launched the Jal Jeevan Mission. Already the coverage is from 17 to 40%. And I'm pretty sure that by the time 2024 comes, the 40% will become 90, 95%. And the quality of life of a woman who's fetching water, suddenly she's got a piped water connection in her house. That is a dramatic transformation of quality of life of the poorest women in India. Now, is the economic rate of return higher than the internal rate of return? Of course, which is why DFI is coming. In terms of the kind of concepts that Mr. Harish talked about, I would only suggest that there are, broadly 4 stages in the infrastructure life cycle. I'm talking about physical infrastructure. I can happily talk about digital infrastructure where we are active. I can talk about smart cities and urbanization. But the single biggest feature of the Indo-Pacific is that it's got nearly 3/4 of the world's population. And everything that is linked to demographics is going to play out over the next 10 years. We have seen this change rapidly in India with the Jan Dhan bank accounts, with the Aadhaar enabled mobiles. Suddenly, soft infrastructure is taking a leap like this. How can hard infrastructure get installed? So in terms of green finance, I completely agree with what Harish said. You know, the level of aspirational consumption that an average lower middle class Indian household has is very different from an average middle class European household. For instance, even if we have air conditioning in our house, we will only air condition the room that we are currently in. We will not air condition the whole house, or we will not heat the whole house. We will carry a Sigdi or we'll carry a heater with us. Now, there is, per capita is the only way to look at this. And there are richer countries in the Indo-Pacific, but for most of the operational area of L&T and most of the private sector companies in India, they would not be in such high income countries. In terms of green finance, in terms of ESG, and in terms of SDG washing, I like that term, SDG washing. I get the sense somewhere that, the way OECD country companies got outcompeted on cost by Indian companies, for instance, and then there were barriers put in to make us less competitive. I just wonder, and this is a suggestion for Mr. Harish and the Economic Diplomacy Division, to analyze dispassionately. I hope there is no similar barrier being put on more competitive Indian companies or Indo-Pacific companies by OECD countries, saying, oh, everyone has to have so much ESG that by the time you're done, your cost of the project is prohibitive, and therefore there is no IRR possible. I can see Exim Bank smiling. So this is something that the NABFID should keep in mind, something that CII should keep in mind, and something that MEA should keep in mind. I would just conclude by saying that in 2011, 10 years ago, we had a discussion roundtable in Singapore where the top sovereign wealth funds and pension funds in the world congregated with a few of us in infrastructure. And we asked the question, how are we connecting deals and dollars? And we realized that there is a total mismatch of deals and dollars. The financing is looking for something else, and we in India were trying to offer them something else. So it was like offering non-vegetarian food to vegetarian people. And we realized that the international capital dollar is not looking for construction risk. If I were based in Singapore, I would never invest my dollar into a construction project in India because the risk return trade-off just does not make sense. But if I was a pension fund of Singapore, I would happily take up a stake in Hyderabad Metro because I know that all the construction risk is over. And for the next 50 years, the money, the cash flow will keep coming in. And those of us who spent a lifetime in finance know that a cash flow statement is always more trustworthy than an Excel spreadsheet, which can have all sorts of assumptions and produce all kinds of returns. So the international dollar is looking for cash flow statement businesses, not spreadsheet businesses, which is why I would strongly urge all the DFIs present in this call to please give your money to governments. We in the private sector can never assume the same kind of risk that sovereigns can. So please give your money to governments. And then once the construction is done, we will use the international dollar to buy these assets from the governments of the Indo-Pacific countries. I call this caterpillars turning into butterflies. Caterpillars are best handled by governments using private sector contractors, but funding from government. And butterflies is where the international dollars come and pick up these lovely looking cash flow generating assets. Thank you, Mr. Harish.
Thank you very much, Shailesh, for that, for those remarks. I think you have correctly encapsulated the earlier point that I had made, that while blended finance and PPP will continue to be important, we cannot downplay the role of ODA, concessional finance to national governments, and making available the necessary resources for national governments to execute the development projects in their countries. And this is vital. We all want private sector to play a very important role. And I think, Shailesh, you have highlighted how this role can come about after the infrastructure has been created and a necessary framework is put in for cash flows, which would make it attractive for private capital to flow in. I think that was a very useful framework to have put it in that manner, with a good example of Hyderabad Metro to boot. I think that illustrates it better for all our listeners and for our panelists. I want to thank CII for organizing this wonderful session on development finance and its role in the Indo-Pacific region, and to all the panelists and participants who took part. Very useful for us because development finance is vital. And we need the stock markets, and we need the multilateral development banks, and more importantly, the development arms of national governments who have played a vital role for bringing about development in the various countries of the Indo-Pacific. These are our partners, and we need to work together to create a suitable framework for bringing about development and for making available the necessary funding that is needed for putting in place infrastructure. We have important takeaways, and I'm sure CII will incorporate these when they prepare the overall outcome documents for this business summit. I want to thank you once again for being present here today, and look forward to another occasion to interact with all of you. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Harish. Thank you all the esteemed guests for this session, speakers. With that, we close the session. Thank you, and we'll meet at the next session, which starts at 2:30. Look forward to you there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.